Bonjour tout le monde, merci pour cette présentation et désolé, excusez-moi, mais je ne parle pas français, ensuite il faut que je présente en anglais, c'est meilleur comme ça, ok? Bon, l'influence des liens sociaux sur la santé et I want to thank Dr. Jen, for inviting me to come and present this work today. And I'd also like to thank my funders, the National Institutes of Health, who has funded a lot of the research that I've done here. Those are the particular agencies that have funded my research as well as the programs. And we are involved in a fair amount of work now on understanding how to implement prevention programs and health promotion programs in a variety of different settings. And I've been very active with the Center for Preventive Implementation Methodology, as well as a number of research projects looking specifically at social networks and health. And I'd also like to acknowledge a postdoctoral student of mine, Kar-Hai Chen. You'll see a little bit of his work, Kar-Hai Chu, a little bit of his work in this presentation. So this morning I want to present to you work that we've been doing on understanding social networks, how social networks work, and how they influence health behaviors in particular. And I will start out by defining a social network as a set of relations. And there are lots of different relationships that we can discuss. We oftentimes analyze friendships, who talks to whom, who communicates with whom, who goes to whom for advice, and trading relationships among countries, and exchanges between firms, market processes, collaborations among organizations involved in delivering healthcare services, coalitions. There are networks everywhere, and I know all of you are familiar with networks because you live in them, interact with them, and reside in them every day, all the time. And although all of us think of networks as being Facebook, in fact, Facebook is only one example of what a network is like, and we've had networks for our entire existence as human beings. And I will be focusing on many of these kinds of common relationships, friendships, advice-seeking, discussion, and so on. So when we analyze networks, we oftentimes draw diagrams of who's connected to whom. And here is a simple social network. Bob and Sue are friends with one another. Bob is also friends with Liz. And we see that Bob and Sue are also friends with Ted. And Sue has the friendships that she has. Each one of these lines showing sort of who is connected to whom and how they're related. Now, the curious thing about social relationships is that we can calculate distances in those relationships, how far apart any two people are from one another. So we know here that Bob and Sue are directly connected, so they're one step away from one another. And then Bob is 2 steps away from Sam, and so on. Now, the distance from Bob to Sam is 2 steps. However, the distance from Sam, to, he keeps going away. Come back, Sam, come back. The distance from Sam to Bob is 4 steps. So there are directions in relationships, and those directions are very, very important. There's oftentimes hierarchy based on these directions. So I have been trying to be friends with Dr. Jen for a long time, but she has refused my friendship invitations, and so that creates a power imbalance in our relationship, right? And so these steps, these distances in relationships give rise to the common phenomenon that you're all familiar with, the 6 degrees of separation and the small world phenomenon. Okay, so why do we study social networks? Well, it turns out that networks are very, very important for most of the kinds of health conditions that we are concerned about. We know that disease is spread through networks, right? If you never want to get a cold, stay inside your house or your apartment the rest of your life. You will never get sick again. That's not a lot of fun, but it is one way to keep yourself protected. So we know that disease is spread through contact networks. And we know that behaviors spread through networks. So networks are important for infectious epidemiology, but also important for chronic conditions such as diabetes and health behaviors related to obesity, physical activity, smoking and drinking, and so on. And we know that if we want new ideas to spread in a community, we have to understand how those networks channel the spread of those ideas. So if you want to introduce new clinical practices, we know that they spread through social networks. And it's important for policy and planning processes, and I'll show you a little bit of data on how networks influence the spread of new policies. And in particular, we know that networks are very important for understanding how markets function and how new ideas, the diffusion of innovation spread through networks. So I showed you a simple, small network of Bob, Sue, Ted, and Amy, in fact, we analyze much larger networks. Here are some data from some work I've been doing among adolescents in 10th grade. These are friendships as well as romantic relationships, popularity relationships, and so on. And you can see here that there are lots of different people in this network, and they have lots of different relationships with one another. And those different relationships influence different behaviors, attitudes, knowledge, and so on. And in particular, you can see I've graphed this network based on color being boys, color being sex, boys are blue, girls are red, and you can see that the red dots tend to be associated with one another and the blue ones with each other as well. Boys are more likely to be friends with boys, girls more likely to be friends with girls. And as a father of a daughter, I'm very happy that that finding tends to be very robust in lots of different settings. We also study professional relationships. So here is a network of physicians. This is a network of who physicians go to for advice and discussion about a particular health issue, a particular therapy that they might prescribe. And you can see that these physicians also demonstrate homophily. Those physicians with European surnames are more likely to be connected to one another, and those with Asian surnames more likely to be connected to one another. So there are almost two separate networks. And you can see that, of course, there are some physicians that are very popular and others less so. So we can identify those important individuals in the network based on these network nominations. And this is work that I had been doing in partnership with a pharmaceutical company, and the minute we showed them this data, they were quite happy because now they could identify who were the important physicians they needed to contact in order to try to get their new drug established in the marketplace. They could also find out that they had been spending all of their energy with this group of physicians over here and ignoring this group over here. And in fact, that happens quite frequently when we do health promotion programs and other kinds of communication activities. We oftentimes are focused in one area of a network without realizing that we're ignoring an entirely different part of the network. So here's some data that I collected from individuals who run after-school programs in Hawaii. We asked these after-school program directors to nominate other directors that they would go to for advice about implementing a new program. And as you know, Hawaii is a set of separate islands. And it turns out when we got the data back and analyzed it, the networks were completely segregated by the different islands that they reside on. And so here was a clear example of how measuring the social networks showed us that there's a geographic separation as well. And we quickly understood that if we wanted to work with these communities, we'd be actually working with 6 separate networks as well as a few individuals that were entirely disconnected from the network. So I want to mention a couple of properties of social networks that we know quite a lot about. So it turns out now we've been collecting data, social network data in a lot of different settings for quite some time. And there are a few principles now that are very well established that we see over and over again in networks. And one of them is homophily. It turns out that people associate with others like themselves. That's not surprising. When you look at your friends, it turns out you're practically looking in a mirror, right? They reflect right back onto you. Sometimes that's a scarier sight for some of us than others. But we know, for example, among adolescents, boys associate with boys, girls with girls, ethnicity, religious preference, many socio-demographic characteristics influence who we associate with. And that homophily constrains our behavior because we're embedded in networks of people like ourselves. but it also makes it easier for persuasion to spread among people who are similar because of that homophily. We also know that networks tend towards transitivity. So by transitivity, I mean friends of friends become friends. So in this little diagram, we see that John is friends with both Bob and Ken, and over time, we can expect that Bob and Ken will become friends. So my presence here is a direct function now of transitivity because Dr. Joanne St. Charles and I are friends. She's friends with Dr. Yoon, and so eventually she makes the introduction to me. After considerable effort and persuasion on my part, I convince her that I'm the right person to come and speak. She's still not so sure about that, and I've got the rest of the day to persuade her. So if you have time in the hallway, please convince her that this was the best keynote address you've ever had, right? So, but we know that networks tend towards transitivity, and when we analyze them over time, we can see the emergence of this transitivity. And transitivity is an important property because it reduces dissonance in the network. In a situation like this, there's some imbalance in this network because Ken is friends with John, and eventually it will be important for this friendship to either form, or if not, this triad will evolve in different ways. And we use these network principles to make statistical analyses on social networks over time. Another property that we're very familiar with now is something called centralization, or a network being scale-free. And what happens in many networks is that there are some nodes that are very, very central and many others that are much less central. So in the network of people in this room, there are 2 or 3 people, again, I'll refer to Dr. Jen, who is very, very popular, right? Everybody knows her, they want to go out to dinner with her, they want to be her friend, and so on. And then there are other people like myself, we're marginal in the network, we reside out here on the periphery, we have few friends, we eat lots of meals by ourselves, and it can tend to be a little bit lonely out there. So if you see somebody by themselves, reach out, give them a hand, and introduce them to somebody very popular. And we've seen this principle in many different settings. It emerged most specifically when analyzing the World Wide Web. It turns out there are some websites that are very, very popular. And if you create a new website, you want to link to that very central website because that means lots of people will be able to come to your website. And so this is a process whereby these central nodes become more and more central over time. Some people refer to this as the rich get richer, and I think that there's some truth to that. Finally, the other thing that we know about networks is they tend to have a small world quality. By small world, I mean that there are fewer steps apart from any one person and anybody else in the network than you would expect by chance. So it turns out that eventually, if we start talking, we will find out that we have somebody in common or friends of friends of friends in common and realize that the world is a much smaller place than we would expect it to be if networks were purely random. And that occurs because in networks, in large networks, there are pockets of dense interconnectivity, and those dense pockets are connected to each other by these bridging links of people that are connected to 2 separate groups or disparate areas in the network. And so when we analyze large networks, communities, populations, nations, and so on, we find this tendency for there to be a lot of local clustering and bridges that connect those local clusters that make the world a much smaller world than would occur by chance. So we understand a lot about how networks are structured. And what I've always been interested in is the way networks influence the spread of ideas, practices, diseases, and other things. And I want to focus a little bit now on the things that we know about how networks structure diffusion. And I've got a small little animation that I built this week to show you what this process looks like. Here is a network, and we have behavior on these individuals individuals in the network, and you notice that as the behavior spreads through the network, it tends to spread to other people that are connected, and then those little densely connected regions of the network fill with adopters. So there is a contagion effect whereby people are influenced by others they're connected to, and that influences their behavioral decisions. And we have a fair amount of data on this process. In general, we understand how diffusion occurs by understanding that people who are in networks filled with users are more likely to become users themselves. So, for example, person A has only one other person in their network who's using a behavior of interest, and so person A is much less likely to adopt that behavior. So we know, for example, if we're studying smoking, person A is much less likely to become a smoker than person B. Person B is surrounded by smokers, and eventually all of that social influence convinces them to start smoking or drinking or using condoms or doing whatever it is that we are interested in studying from a network perspective. And it turns out that this social influence effect is quite widespread across a whole bunch of different domains. So we know, for example, that an adolescent who has smoking friends is more than 2 times as likely to become a smoker himself. A person who has drinking friends is 2 times as likely to become a drinker or a binge drinker. Physicians who have colleagues who use a particular therapy are more likely to use that therapy rather than another one. And in fact, we know that physicians are more likely to use therapies that their colleagues use regardless of what the clinical guidelines say is an appropriate behavior. And it turns out that makes a lot of sense, right? As human beings, I'm much more likely to be convinced to do something by my friends or my colleagues than I am by a printed report which says this is what the clinical guidelines say. We also have a lot of evidence working in developing countries that influence spreads through social networks. So we know, for example, that if a woman has friends who use a particular contraceptive method, they're more likely to use that method as well. And this is interesting because, as you know, there are many different choices of contraceptive method that people can choose. And rarely do individuals choose the one that may be most appropriate for them. They're more likely to choose the one that their friends use. Now, a lot of our evidence comes from understanding the way networks influence individual choices and individual behaviors, and we collect a lot of data on individual social networks. But networks can also operate at larger levels of interaction, inter-firm cooperation, collaboration, the way states trade with one another, communicate with one another, and so on. And I've been lately engaged in some work trying to understand how policies spread through networks. And as many of you know, understanding health policy is a very important process. We are all often engaged in trying to get better health policies implemented. Well, it turns out in the past decade, there have been 3 treaties ratified by the World Health Organization that have spread to at least 70 or 80% of countries across the globe. These are the 3 treaties, and these are the diffusion trajectories for those treaties. The one I'm mostly interested in is the FCTC. The FCTC is the Framework Convention for Tobacco Control. Yes, this is the treaty that has brought you clean, smoke-free workplaces, bans on tobacco advertising, and warning labels on tobacco products. So the FCTC was introduced to the World Health Organization in 2003, and as of 2011, over 85% of countries have ratified the FCTC, and you can see its rather rapid diffusion in this time period. So this is some sort of representative countries. Norway was the first to ratify the FCTC. It spread all the way up here. Italy, a favorite country of mine because my ancestors come from Italy, is a rather late adopter. And of course, up here is the United States, who has yet to ratify the FCTC and never will, unfortunately. We studied, we have some data on interactions in this forum called Global Link, which is an anti-tobacco control forum. And just to illustrate the network effects that we seem to be finding in the ratification of the FCTC, the first 15% of countries to ratify the FCTC, the earliest adopters, participated in this online forum quite extensively. You can see how well connected they are in this network. When we look at the non-ratifying countries, the 17% who have yet to ratify, you can see that the network is much less densely connected, much more sparse. And in fact, most of the connectivity in that network is directly a function of the United States and Switzerland, two non-adopting countries who admittedly are both a little bit strange when it comes to analyzing global systems. And then you can see how many countries are isolated, and that isolation, being on the margins of that network, seems to be associated with not adopting the FCTC. So I have another animation here to illustrate how this network may be influencing the uptake and adoption of the FCTC. We have data on who's connected to whom and who's communicating to whom on this online forum. We're looking at specifically when countries start to ratify the FCTC, and we can plot their interaction with one another. And in this animation, when a country ratifies, they turn red, they change color. And so here's all of the communication among them. You can see some of the early countries are connected in this network, but some of those that are isolated also ratify it. But right about now, you can see it. Just about all of the countries that are connected to the online forum are communicating and interacting with one another, whereas those that are not involved are much less likely to adopt and ratify the FCTC. And we run statistical models on these things to show whether or not being in this network and communicating with other countries that have already ratified the FCTC increases your likelihood of adoption. And so far, the statistical evidence seems to indicate that's the case. And now we're still working, trying to develop and improve the tools to do that analysis. So we know what networks look like. We know that they seem to be very important for influencing individual behavior as well as country behavior, organizations, and so on. The question, of course, that everybody started to ask me very early on is, well, what can you do for me? How can I use network data to try to accelerate behavior change? And so we turn to networks to try to figure out what kinds of things, what kinds of interventions, how could we use network data to improve organizational performance, improve our health promotion interventions, and so on. And it turns out that there's a fair amount of evidence that using opinion leaders identified via network analysis is a very effective way to improve interventions and accelerate behavior change. And it's actually very easy to do. It's very intuitive. And of course, most of the time when you're talking to organizations about how to improve their performance, you are talking to people in leadership positions. So if you tell them that leaders are important, they're going to be very happy to hear that and say, I think you're right. That's a brilliant idea, right? In the literature, it turns out we've been able to identify so far over 20 studies that have used network data to identify opinion leaders and in a randomized control trial, use them as effective change agents and champions for behavior change. So how do you find opinion leaders? Well, you map the network and you identify those nodes that are in most central positions. This is a network of friendship among adolescents in 6th grade, 12-year-olds. Again, we see girls connected to girls, boys to boys. There's one boy who seems to have 2 girlfriends. He's probably a pretty smart little kid. And then no girls will admit to having friendships with boys, which is probably a reasonable thing to see in the data. So but you can find who these central nodes are and then use them for change agents to accelerate behavior change. We've run computer simulations and show how important it is for behavior change to start with opinion leaders. You can see if you run different kinds of computer simulations that you get much faster uptake of the new idea when opinion leaders are the early adopters relative to people selected at random or those selected on the margins. And this simulation is important because it illustrates something that we know to be true about diffusion. It turns out that most of the time, new ideas and practices are first embraced by those people that are on the margin of the network, right? Those people that are outside on the periphery are free to innovate. They are unshackled by what is normative in the community because their ties are to other people in other communities, and their point of reference is to other areas in the world or community or whatever. That enables them to try new ideas and practices. And in fact, there's no risk to them to do that because the status quo within the community is not beneficial to them. Whereas opinion leaders are central in the network, and as a consequence, they need to generally support the norms of what is practiced normally in that network. So they're inhibited from change. And that's one of the reasons that change takes so long, because people who are at the center of the network have as an inherent interest to maintain the status quo. And that's why diffusion takes so long, because it usually starts out on the margins and takes a long time to percolate to the opinion leaders and then spread more rapidly. Now, it's also true that there are different kinds of opinion leaders. There are national opinion leaders, regional ones, and local ones. And national opinion leaders are very important for generating awareness and interest of new ideas and practices. But as we move to later stages in the adoption process, many of you are probably familiar with these stages of adoption from the diffusion model. As we move towards the persuasion, evaluation, and decision stages in adoption, people who function as regional opinion leaders play a much larger role. And finally, when it comes to the later stages of adoption, actually using the behavior and confirming your behavior change, it is the local opinion leaders that serve as important influencers. And that is because for people to change their behavior, they need other respected colleagues that they can trust and that they go or feel comfortable going to for advice in order to change their behavior. If you ask me to do something new, I'm only going to do it when I know I have somebody that I respect in my community who's already doing it. That reduces the barriers to my adoption and behavior change, and it makes it much easier for me to then start a new behavior. So there are 6 simple steps to doing opinion leader interventions. You get your network data, identify the opinion leaders, recruit them as champions, and then here is the hardest step in the process. Oftentimes, you've got to convert them to the behavior that you're interested in promoting. Now, a lot of times when I go out to do this in the field, I carry a very large hammer with me because that tends to be the most effective way to get them to change their behavior. And I actually do it in order to illustrate that that is a very hard step in the process. But I maintain that if you do not have the support of people who are central in the networks to start a new behavior, you're never going to make any progress with other aspects of your communication and change program. As long as the people at the center are resistant to what you're trying to do, it's going to be a lot harder for you to get change in that community. So, as I've been doing this work on identifying opinion leaders through network analysis, it occurs to me that there are many other kinds of network interventions that we can imagine. And so I've been doing a lot of research lately on ways to use social networks for accelerating behavior change beyond simple opinion leader models. And these network interventions can occur when we select change agents, or when we define groups, or we use network data to change network structure. Any kind of situation where we use network analysis to assist a behavior change program is a network intervention. And I have 3 small principles to underscore that you should always follow when doing a network intervention. The first is that you've got to have well-defined programmatic goals, right? And the goals matter. So the example that I always give is if you want to slow the spread of STDs, you can do that in 2 ways. 1, you can accelerate the uptake of condom use, or 2, you can try to sever or fragment sexual contact networks. And those are 2 different programmatic goals that will suggest different kinds of network strategies. Second, and I hate to admit this, my original training is in mathematics, and so the idea of behavioral science theory was always kind of ludicrous to me, and I would roll my eyes at it. But it turns out that actually theory is really, really important. Understanding and being able to articulate why people do and don't do the things that they do and don't do is very critically important. And so understanding the motivations and barriers to behavior change is very, very important. And a well-articulated behavior change theory will go a long way towards helping you implement effective programs. And three, and one of the most critical components, is to understand that you have to use networks to learn from them as well as try to induce change on them. So we oftentimes have a mindset which says, I'm going to understand the network, and that will enable me to push ideas and practices out to the network so I can use it to more effectively diffuse behavior change programs. But as a behavior change specialist, it's critically important that you spend time learning from the network what their needs are and what the appropriate kinds of programs would be created that address those needs. And a lot of times, by contacting those opinion leaders once you've identified them, that gives you a very good conduit to learn from the community what their concerns are. Very often, we have contact with people in underserved communities that are actually on the margins of that community, and they may not represent the best interests of that community. So being able to understand what that network looks like and how to tap into it in different areas is critically important. So that being said, I offer you this table which sort of details all the different kinds of network interventions that we have available. And in this table, I have divided network interventions up into 4 broad strategies, okay? And the first strategy is identification of particular individuals to be change agents or champions. Now, there are lots of different kinds of individuals that you might want to identify to be your change agent. I've discussed at length the use of opinion leaders, and they're very important, and we know from lots of studies how effective they can be. But you might not always want to identify the leaders in a community. There are other kinds of individuals that occupy critical positions in the network that might be more effective for the particular change program that you're trying to implement. And so each one of these strategies has several tactics. The added complication is that each one of these tactics, from a network perspective, has multiple operationalizations or multiple different kinds of mathematical algorithms you can use to identify those individuals. So leaders are important, but it turns out from a network perspective, we can identify what it means to be a leader in a network of up to 10 to 12 different ways using different mathematical algorithms. So the first point is, you've got a lot of choices, okay? It turns out that the quiver that you have filled with all these arrows is quite large. So there's lots of different choices that you can make. And you might want to identify bridges, key players, peripherals, all different kinds of individuals as being the first ones you want to be the champions for your program. Now, rather than, since we don't have a lot of time this morning, although I would love to take your entire morning, I know that there are other more important people that you need to hear from today, so I'm not going to spend time going through all of the different tactics and all of the different strategies and so on. Let me quickly say that you have segmentation techniques where you identify different subgroups and positions in the network, induction techniques and tactics where you try to spur change on the network, and then the alteration. Originally, I used to call this manipulation, and then I realized that didn't sound very good. Alteration sounds a little nicer. So we have alteration tactics where you specifically try to change the network. So I created this little hypothetical network in order to illustrate all of the different tactics that you have available to you. And since we, as I said, don't have a lot of time this morning, I just offered this one slide which provides a graphical display where we illustrate each one of these different tactics so that you, the reader, can see, oh, this is what that one looks like, that's what this one looks like, and so on. And let me just mention, so all of this work is done in a statistical program platform called R, which is a free program. All of this analysis is written in an R script, which is freely available to anybody that wants it or anybody that's willing to subject themselves to doing this kind of work. Okay, so of course now I can go into lots of detail about what all these different network interventions are, but what you really want to know is, well, how do I decide? If you're giving me 24 choices or 48 choices, how do I decide which kind of network intervention is appropriate for me? Well, there's a couple of different principles that we know are important. One is that the kind of network data that you have and the kinds of relationships that you can analyze is important for selecting an intervention. And we also know that you have to understand something about the existing network structure. You may be working in a setting where there's no network and your first job is to build a network. Or you may be working with a network that is very fragmented and you know that you need to increase the cohesion of that network before you try to induce change on it. And it may be that the existing prevalence of the behavior that you're studying is important. If the behavior is already widely adopted, that suggests a different strategy than if you are working in a setting where nobody is using the behavior you're interested in promoting. And of course, there are many perceived characteristics we know of the behaviors that we study, and they also influence strategy selection. But as I said, behavior change theory is really important, and so lately I've been doing some work trying to understand the relationship between what we know about behavior change theory, what we know about what motivates people to adopt certain behaviors, and your choice of particular strategies and tactics. And so here is a slide. This is the first slide I've presented for which I have no idea if this makes any sense or not, okay? Everything else I've got data for, evidence, and all of that business. This is entirely speculative. So if you're angry at this point and you see this, you're willing to challenge me on it and provide some better advice. But this is my attempt to link social behavioral change mechanisms with the selection of specific types of network intervention strategies and tactics that you might choose. So, for example, if you know that power is an important motivating factor in how an organization operates, then you've clearly got to identify leaders in that organization in order to bring about behavior change. However, if one of your concerns is conflict, then you might want to identify bridges. So, for example, in many cases, we've seen data from organizations in which there's been a merger of two different divisions. And you can see, even after 2 years, those two divisions are still not connected to one another. So in that case, you want to find the bridges, the links between those divisions, and strengthen them or build new ones in order to create a more effective organization. Or if the organization is very cohesive, then you want to find the key players in the network, and we have specific algorithms for who those key players are. If isolation is a problem, in many cases, for example, we know that adolescents who are marginal in their social networks tend to be at risk for mental health issues. We know, for example, that if you have few friends, your rates of suicide ideation and suicide attempts go up pretty dramatically. Well, if you want to create an intervention to reach those individuals, you need to find who the peripheral people are in the network and get them connected in either to different friendship networks or to services or something that makes them feel connected, and so on. So anyway, without going into all the details about the different behavior change mechanisms, this is an attempt to link them to choices of particular network tactics. And I'm sure in another 50 years, we'll have all the evidence that makes this table, be something that you can trust and believe in. Okay, so I've already been given the sign that I'm running out of time, so let me conclude with a couple of remarks. I hope that you get a sense that network theories and methods are fairly well developed at this stage, and they are critical to understanding human behavior, and we can use them to understand diffusion and behavior change processes. And that we have network interventions that can improve different kinds of health outcomes and organizational performance. And from my own perspective, to me, this provides the opportunity to test theoretically interesting processes on networks and human behavior. Now, the Christmas shopping season is upon us. I know many of you have academic friends that perhaps could use a present that is a little bit different or one that they would cherish for the rest of their life. So if you act now, Amazon.com, the bookstore out in the hallway, you can get a present that will give and give and give over many years. So that's about all I have to say. Thank you all very much. Et merci beaucoup pour votre attention.